3 days ago, our expedition changed forever. We didn't lose Sun in battle. There were no bullets, no explosions, just one terrible accident. And, in a matter of seconds, one of our closest teammates was gone. We searched the river until there was no hope left. All we could do was carve his name into a tree beside the ravine and promise to finish the mission he would never return to complete now. With no map, no compass, and one less brother beside us, the three of us must continue deeper into one of the most unforgiving jungles in Vietnam. This is part 7 of the Lost Gold Expedition. We woke to the sound of the first birds greeting the dawn. Outside the shelter, the fog was so thick it looked almost solid. The moon had already disappeared. For a short while before sunrise, the world seemed even darker than it had been during the night. Although we were eager to see the unfamiliar land ahead, none of us hurried outside. Instead, we lay quietly inside the shelter, talking in low voices while we waited for the morning light. As the sun climbed above the mountains, Hung scrambled up the tallest tree nearby. With the binoculars, a few minutes later, he climbed back down. There's nothing yet, just a vast stretch of forest. The fog hasn't lifted enough to see any farther. After a brief discussion, we agreed to continue west. For now, our search would remain focused within a radius of about 20 kilometers from the ravine where we had crossed. Somewhere inside that enormous wilderness, our destination had to exist. The forest on this side of the mountains was noticeably different. The trees stood farther apart. The ground was dry beneath our feet. It looked as though no rain had fallen here for months. The storms we had endured in the valleys below had never reached this higher country. Around mid-morning, Dang asked me to climb another tree and take a look. I picked the tallest one growing near the crest of a ridge and climbed all the way to the top. The view stretched for miles. Rolling forests rose and fell like endless green waves. Far to the west, mountain ranges faded into the horizon. To the northwest, the land gradually flattened until the hills blended into the surrounding jungle. This didn't look like rugged mountains anymore. It felt more like a vast highland plateau. Then, something caught my eye. At first, I couldn't tell what was different. One treetop seemed to rise higher than everything around it. I quickly raised the binoculars. My heart skipped. There it was, a single towering tree. Its crown was darker than the surrounding forest. Its shape was unlike any tree I had seen before. A strange surge of excitement rushed through me. For an instant, I could barely breathe. Could this be the swamp cypress we had been searching for all this time? I almost shouted, but I stopped myself. What if I was wrong? I slid down the trunk as fast as I could, trying to hide my excitement. I told the others what I had seen. Within moments, we were moving again, this time with renewed hope. The afternoon sun blazed overhead. The heat drove every animal into the shade. The forest fell strangely quiet. Only the crunch of dry leaves beneath our boots and the endless drone of cicadas broke the silence. Now and then, a faint breeze drifted in from the southwest. It stirred the treetops for only a moment before disappearing again. From above, the land had looked almost flat. Walking through it was another story. The ground rose and dipped constantly. Every hill seemed to hide another one behind it. Sweat poured from my body until my clothes were soaked. Almost as quickly, the moisture dried into a layer of salt against my skin. The heat settled deep into my muscles. Every step felt heavier than the last. Still, none of us slowed down. We all knew we might finally be close by early afternoon. The forest began to thin. Small patches of dry grass appeared between the trees. Ahead, I caught glimpses of open sky through the trunks. Without saying a word, we all quickened our pace. Something was waiting just beyond the edge of the forest. We could all feel it. A few minutes later, we stepped out of the trees, and every one of us stopped in our tracks. Standing alone in the open was an enormous, ancient tree. Its dark green crown stretched proudly against the bright blue sky. Even from a distance, it radiated a quiet strength that demanded attention. Between us and the tree lay nearly 400 meters of open ground. The earth was rocky, only scattered shrubs clung to the dry soil. Beyond the giant tree, a broad hillside rolled gently upward, covered with sparse, sun-bleached grass. For several long seconds, none of us spoke. Then, almost at the same time, we started walking toward it. There was no doubt anymore. We had finally found the tree we had been searching for. The swamp cypress, its massive trunk, leaned slightly toward the northeast. Even with all three of us joining hands, we couldn't have wrapped our arms halfway around it. Its dark bark was deeply cracked with age, streaked with pale patches of lichen. Great branches spread outward from high above, casting cool shade across the ground below. Beneath the tree, not a single blade of grass grew. Instead, the earth was covered by a thick carpet of fallen needle-like leaves. As I stepped onto them, they gave softly beneath my boots and released the unmistakable scent of cypress, a smell unlike anything else in the forest. Hume slowly circled the giant tree, running one hand across its rough bark. A smile finally appeared on his face. I've spent most of my life in the jungle, but I've never seen a tree like this. No one can ever claim they've seen everything the forest has to offer. Deng looked up into the towering branches swaying gently overhead. Relief washed across his face. We've made it. We've finally reached the right place. His voice faded. Sun would have been so happy to see this. His eyes filled with tears. I stood beneath the ancient tree, listening to the wind whisper through its branches. Beyond it, the golden hillside shimmered in the afternoon light. For the first time in many days, the weight on my chest began to lift. The fear, the exhaustion, the uncertainty, all of it seemed to drift away with the wind. Deng looked toward the grassy hill beyond the tree. Then he smiled. We'll camp here tonight. But first, let's see what's waiting for us up there. For the next 4 days, we searched in wide zigzags across nearly 6 miles of forest, widening our sweep with every change of direction. Those were some of the hardest days of the expedition. To stay on course, we forced ourselves to move in straight lines, no matter what stood in our way. Thick vines, fallen trees, steep ravines. We climbed over everything instead of going around. By the end of each day, our clothes were hanging in tatters. Even our rubber sandals were giving up, one strap after another snapping loose. Luckily, Each of us carried spare straps. Deng even packed needles and thread, so every evening we sat by the fire, patching our clothes before setting off again the next morning. I still had one brand new set of clothes buried deep inside my backpack. I never touched it. That was for the journey home, if there ever was one. After 4 more changes of direction, we had covered every section of forest we had planned to search. We had climbed tree after tree with the binoculars, scanned miles in every direction, and still no grassland, no giant swamp cypress, nothing. It was time to admit we were searching the wrong place. That evening, we made camp beside a narrow waterfall, spilling down a cliff. The water dropped from halfway up the mountainside before winding away as a clear little stream between smooth boulders. Standing below it, the waterfall looked as though it burst straight out of the rock itself. Camp followed the same routine as always. Pitch the shelter, gather firewood, prepare dinner. But tonight, for the first time in days, we had enough clean water to wash properly. I wandered upstream until I stood beneath the falls. Cold water pounded against my shoulders and back, like thousands of tiny hands. Every ache, every layer of sweat, every trace of dirt was carried away downstream. Even the cuts covering my arms and legs stopped stinging beneath the icy water. For the first time since leaving the gorge, I felt human again. When I looked up, I froze. A brilliant rainbow shimmered through the mist, glowing above me like a bridge of light. Bare trees stood silently on top of the cliff, their dark branches etched against the evening sky. The sun was sinking. The mountain's shadow slowly spread across the forest beside the stream. Realizing how late it was, I quickly washed my clothes and climbed back toward camp. As soon as I stepped away from the waterfall, the roaring faded. The forest became strangely peaceful, almost too peaceful, when I returned. Deng was slicing wild banana blossoms beside the fire. A few minutes later, Hung appeared from downstream, carrying a string of freshly caught fish. While I had been enjoying the waterfall, the two of them had already finished every chore around camp. I felt embarrassed. They hadn't forgotten me. They had simply wanted me to rest. Ever since this journey began, I had always been the youngest, and they had quietly looked after me, like an older brother would. I filled our mess tins with water and hung them over the fire. Wild banana blossoms have to be boiled once before they're cooked. That night, we ate grilled venison with fish soup made from banana blossoms. The soup had a slight bitterness, but after days of eating nothing except roasted meat, it tasted incredible. The next morning, we turned northwest, cutting back across the same stretch of forest we had searched before opening another search pattern. We needed to return to a known reference point. Otherwise, these endless mountains would become a maze. And once that happened, we might never know which direction we were really heading. It took us more than 2 days to reach the giant tree where we had stopped for lunch. After leaving the Sanglair forest, I was amazed. Hung had led us straight back to it without a map, without a compass, almost as if the forest itself was guiding him to this day. I still don't know how he did it. He seemed to possess an instinct that allowed him to find his way through endless wilderness, where anyone else would have become hopelessly lost. Instead of camping beneath the tree, We continued down to the foot of the mountain and pitched our shelter on a small patch of grass beside a narrow stream. Dang decided we would rest for the remainder of the day. I desperately needed it. The exhaustion had finally caught up with me, and worry drains a man's strength far faster than walking ever could. I could see the same concern in Dang's eyes. Only Hung looked calm, but he had grown quieter with each passing day. I knew why. He still blamed himself for San's death, even though none of us ever did, not even in our hearts. For the first time since the expedition began, I slept deeply. When I awoke, long shadows stretched across the meadow. Hung was nowhere to be seen. Only Dang remained, sitting beneath a tree, carefully cleaning his rifle. I washed my face in the stream before sitting beside him. "Where's Hung?" I asked. "He went into the forest." Then Dang smiled. "Why don't you sleep a little longer?" I laughed. "I've already slept for hours." He locked a magazine into his rifle and stood. "Stay here, Hai. I'm going to see if I can find us something to eat." As soon as he disappeared into the trees, I grabbed my knife and went to gather firewood. There were plenty of dry branches scattered around the clearing. Within minutes, I had dragged back a pile big enough to last us all night. With nothing else to do, I sat beneath the tree again, absent-mindedly watching the quiet forest bathed in afternoon sunlight. Everything was still. A gentle breeze rippled through the grass. Fresh green shoots were pushing up beneath the dry yellow blades, fed by the rain we'd had a few days earlier. Then, a thought flashed through my mind. So quickly, I almost lost it. I forced myself to hold on to it. Grass, rain, mountains, something connected. Suddenly, it came together. During the past 2 weeks, the only grasslands we'd seen were high on the sun-scorched border ridges. Everywhere else, the mountains were covered with thick rainforest. Occasionally, we'd cross tiny clearings like this one, barely larger than a backyard. So where could a vast grassland possibly exist? I remembered something from my geography classes. A grassland, or even the rolling grassy hills Hung had imagined, would most likely exist in a hotter, drier climate, where dense forests couldn't easily survive. Then another memory surfaced, a mountain range, like a giant stone wall. Where had I seen it? I closed my eyes, searching my memory. Then I had it. The day Hung and I went digging for wild yams. Beyond the Sanglair forest, I rushed into the shelter, grabbed the binoculars, and climbed the tallest tree I could find. Looking west, there it was, a high mountain range rising above every surrounding peak, stretching south as far as I could see. To the east, the mountains were lower, layered one behind another, in broad curves that gradually descended toward the sea. I felt my pulse quicken. The grassland has to be up there. Down here, there's simply too much rain. The forest is far too healthy. For the first time in days, I felt real hope. I wanted nothing more than to climb those mountains immediately. As I climbed back down, Hung was just returning. He carried our waterproof canvas bag, slung over one shoulder. It bulged so much, it barely looked like the same bag. "What's in there?" I asked. "You guess." He lowered it onto the grass with a grin and wiped the sweat from his forehead. I stared at it. It wasn't game. If he'd shot an animal, he'd have carried it openly. It wasn't roots or fruit either. The bag looked surprisingly light. Finally, I laughed. I give up. Hung smiled. Honey, I found a wild beehive. I only took about half of it. There was no way we could carry the whole thing. I untied the bag. Inside were thick, golden honeycombs, still warm from the hive. The smell alone was enough to make my mouth water as we squeezed the honey into our canteens. Deng returned, carrying an armful of wild yams. I nearly worked myself to death digging these. He laughed. And no game today? I asked. There was plenty. I just figured you two were probably tired of eating meat every day. So today, we're having something different. While we prepared dinner, I told them about my theory, the high mountain range, the dry climate, the possibility that the grassland lay beyond it. Deng listened without interrupting when I finished. He picked up the binoculars and climbed a nearby tree himself. He studied the western horizon for a long time. When he came back down, he didn't say a word. Instead, he turned to Hung. You'd better have a look too. Hung chose the tallest tree in the clearing and climbed almost to the top. Several minutes later, he came back down. Deng looked at him immediately. Well? Hung nodded slowly. We won't know for certain until we get up there. But I think Hai may be right. Deng stood quietly for a moment, thinking. Finally, he spoke. The base of those mountains isn't far from here. If we push hard, we should reach it in a day. What comes after that, we'll deal with when we get there. We have to open a new search route anyway. Then his expression turned serious. But we need to move quickly. If the rainy season catches us, we'll be in real trouble. Hung gave a confident smile. Don't worry. Think we're getting close. Then he turned toward me. Hi. Have you ever had wild yam cooked with fresh honey? I shook my head. No. Then peel those yams. Cut them into little cubes. I'm going to show you one of the best desserts you'll ever eat. For the first time in many days. I saw the old Hung again. The weight he'd been carrying since Sun's death seemed, if only for a little while, to lift from his shoulders that evening. We made a simple dessert from wild yams, fresh honey, and tender bee larvae from the comb. I can still remember the taste. Sweet, rich, unlike anything I'd ever eaten before. I've tried making it many times since then. But somehow, it has never tasted the same. Perhaps because no meal is ever separated from the people who shared it. We reached the top of the mountain after nightfall. A little later, the moon rose. It was astonishingly bright. So bright that even the thick mountain mist seemed thinner than usual. Even our campfire looked pale beneath the silver light. Yet that night, a strange feeling returned. The same uneasy feeling I'd had before we reached the gorge. Only now, there was no roar of water echoing through the darkness. Still, something deep inside me refused to rest. I fell asleep, carrying that nameless anxiety with me all night long. I dreamed. Dream after dream. But when morning came, I couldn't remember a single one. I only knew I woke exhausted. Many years later, I often wondered whether that had been some kind of warning. Was it intuition? What people call a sixth sense? Or was it nothing more than coincidence? I still don't know. Even if danger had truly been waiting ahead, when would it come? Where would it come from? And what form would it take? Back then, All I knew was that an invisible weight was pressing against my heart, and I had no idea why. We woke to the first bird singing before dawn outside. The fog was so thick, it looked solid enough to carve with a knife. The moon had already disappeared. The sky was at its darkest. Just before sunrise, inside the tent, the three of us lay awake, quietly talking, eager to see what this new land would reveal when the mist finally lifted. When the sun finally climbed above the horizon, Hung was the first to climb a tree and scan the landscape with the binoculars. When he came back down, he shook his head. Nothing yet. The fog still hanging over the forest. We'll have to get closer. After a short discussion, we agreed to continue west. For now, our search would stay within a radius of about 12 miles from the gorge. Where we had crossed the forest up here felt different. The trees stood farther apart. The ground was dry beneath our feet. It looked as though this part of the mountains hadn't seen rain in months. The storms we'd fought through down below had never reached this high. Around mid-morning, Dang asked me to climb another tree and take a look. I picked one growing near the crest of a slope and climbed all the way to the top from there. An endless stretch of forest rolled across the landscape like gentle green waves. Far to the west, mountain ridges faded one behind another until they disappeared into the horizon. To the northwest, the peaks gradually lowered and blended into the forest below. This didn't feel like steep mountain country anymore. It felt almost like a vast, high plateau. Then, something caught my eye. Just for a split second. A treetop. One that looked different from every other tree around it. I quickly raised the binoculars. There it was. A tall, narrow crown. Dark green. Almost like the spire of a church, rising above the forest. A shiver ran through my body. Every nerve suddenly came alive. Its shape, its color, everything about it reminded me of the swamp cypress we had been searching for. For one wild moment, I wanted to shout, "We found it!" But I stopped myself. What if I was wrong? I slid down the tree as fast as I could, trying to hide my excitement. I told Dang and Hung exactly what I'd seen, without another word. The three of us turned toward the strange tree and hurried through the forest. The afternoon sun blazed overhead. Every animal had retreated into the shade. Even the birds had fallen silent. Only the crunch of dry leaves beneath our boots and the endless drone of cicadas filled the heavy summer air. Every now and then, a faint breeze drifted in from the southwest, barely enough to stir the treetops. Walking through the forest, we quickly realized it wasn't nearly as flat as it had looked from the treetop. The ground rose and fell in long, uneven ridges. Sweat poured off me until my clothes were soaked. Then, almost as quickly, it dried into a thin layer of salt on my skin. The heat seeped into my muscles. Every breath felt hot, every step heavier than the last. Still, none of us slowed down. Around 2 o'clock that afternoon, the forest began to thin. Patches of dry grass appeared between the trees. The canopy slowly opened. Ahead, we could see strips of blue sky shining through the trunks. Without saying a word, we all quickened our pace. Then we stepped out of the forest and froze. Standing alone in the middle of an open clearing was a giant, ancient tree. Its massive crown swayed gently against the bright blue sky. Just looking at the top of that towering tree, you could feel the incredible strength it had gathered over centuries. From the edge of the forest to its trunk stretched an open field nearly 400 yards wide. Only a few clusters of dry shrubs grew from the rocky ground beyond the tree. A broad hillside rolled upward, covered with sparse, sun-bleached grass. A few seconds passed before any of us moved. Then, almost together, we started walking toward it. There was no longer any doubt. This was the swamp cypress, the very tree we had crossed half the country to find. The trunk leaned slightly toward the northeast. It was enormous. Even if the three of us joined hands, we still couldn't have wrapped ourselves halfway around it. Its dark brown bark was deeply cracked with age. White patches of lichen covered much of the trunk. High above us, huge branches spread outward in every direction, casting cool shade over the clearing. Around its base, not a single blade of grass grew. Instead, the ground was buried beneath a thick carpet of fallen needle leaves. Walking across them felt like stepping onto a soft mattress. The air carried that unmistakable scent of evergreen. The rich, resinous fragrance found only among ancient conifers hung slowly circled the giant tree. His rough hand traced the weathered bark. He couldn't stop smiling. I've spent my whole life in the jungle, but I've never seen a tree this magnificent. It reminds you how little any of us truly know about the forest. Dang stood beneath the spreading branches, gazing high into the canopy. Then he smiled, a smile I hadn't seen in weeks. "We made it. We're finally here." His voice caught for a moment. Son would have been so happy to see this. His eyes filled with tears. I stood quietly beneath the whispering branches, listening to the wind moving through the needles overhead. Beyond the tree, the sunlit grassy hillside glowed golden in the afternoon light. At that moment, every hardship, every fear, every mile we'd fought through simply disappeared. Only one feeling remained: hope. Dang finally broke the silence. "We'll camp here tonight first." He pointed toward the grassy hill beyond the ancient tree. "Let's go see what's waiting for us up there." What we discovered beyond that hill changed everything. But none of us realized another nightmare was already waiting. We'll continue in Part 8